The needle pierced his skin. Marco Valentini didn't feel it at first. He was too busy watching Elena Russo die, too busy savoring the way her chest rose and fell behind that oxygen mask, too busy enjoying his own victory. Then the cold hits his bloodstream. His hand moves to his neck, slow, confused. He turns, and that's when he sees her. The young physician he barely noticed, the one who'd been standing there the whole time, silent, invisible. Sophia Russo, Elena's sister. His legs betray him first. Then his vision fractures. The sterile walls of the private medical facility in Brooklyn blur into white noise. He tries to speak, but his throat closes. The same neurotoxin, the same poison he'd slipped into Elena's ricotta cheesecake 3 hours ago. Only this dose is different. This dose is final. Marco's knees hit the floor, and that's when Elena's eyes open behind the mask, clear, focused, alive. She watches him fall. She doesn't blink. He'd called her a traitor, laughed in her face, whispered every cruel word he'd been saving, and she'd laid there, paralyzed but conscious, listening to everything. Now Marco understands. This was never about poison. This was about confession. This was about making him reveal the monster he'd always been. The last thing he sees is Elena's hand slowly removing the oxygen mask. Her lips move. 2 words. Checkmate, Marco. Then, darkness. But how did we get here? How does the most powerful mafia boss in New York get outsmarted by the woman he tried to kill? Before you find out, do yourself a favor, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because what happens next will make you open your mouth in shock. 5 years earlier, Elena Russo stepped into Marco Valentini's office in Lower Manhattan with nothing but a resume and a reputation. She was 26, no family connections, no mafia lineage, just a degree in forensic accounting and a cold determination that made grown men uncomfortable. Marco's underboss had laughed when she applied for a position in the organization's financial operations. "We don't hire women for real work," he'd said. Marco had been different. He'd looked at her portfolio, the way she'd restructured her previous employer's offshore accounts, the efficiency with which she'd buried transactions, and he'd seen something useful, something rare. He hired her on the spot. Within 6 months, Elena had reorganized the Valentini family's entire money laundering infrastructure. She identified leaks, closed vulnerabilities, and increased profit margins by 18%. Marco began inviting her to meetings that most soldiers never attended. She sat in rooms where death sentences were decided over espresso and biscotti. She never flinched, never questioned, never showed weakness. The other men resented her. They whispered that she'd slept her way to the top, that Marco kept her around for reasons that had nothing to do with business. But Elena didn't care about their opinions. She cared about access, about trust, about getting close enough to matter. Because Elena Russo had a mission that had nothing to do with money. Her father, Vincent Russo, had been a small-time bookkeeper for the Valentini organization 15 years ago. He'd made a mistake, a tiny accounting error that Marco had interpreted as theft. Vincent had tried to explain, had begged for understanding, and had promised to fix it. Marco had ordered him executed anyway, burned alive in a warehouse fire in Red Hook. They'd made it look like an accident. Elena was 11 years old. Her sister Sophia had been 6. Their mother died 2 years later. Grief, the doctors said. But Elena knew better. Her mother had died of a broken heart, crushed under the weight of injustice. So Elena had spent 15 years preparing, learning, becoming indispensable. And now, sitting across from Marco Valentini in his office overlooking the Hudson River, she smiled like she hadn't been plotting his destruction since childhood. "You've done well, Elena," Marco said, pouring them both whiskey. "I'm proud of you." She raised her glass. "I learned from the best." He smiled, and Elena thought, not yet, but soon. How far would you go for revenge? And what happens when the person you're hunting starts to trust you? Sophia Russo never wanted to be part of Elena's plan. She was different from her sister, softer, more hopeful, desperate to believe that the world could be good if you just worked hard enough. While Elena had spent years infiltrating the Valentini organization, Sophia had focused on medical school at Columbia University. She wanted to save lives, not take them. But debt has a way of changing people. Medical school tuition in New York City costs over $90,000 a year. Sophia had loans that would follow her for decades. She'd been working double shifts at a diner in Queens, sleeping 4 hours a night, slowly drowning. Then, Marco Valentini had offered to pay for everything. It had happened during a dinner party at his estate in Westchester County. Elena had been there on business, and she'd mentioned her sister's situation offhandedly. Marco had smiled, pulled out his checkbook, and written a number that made Sophia's hands shake. "Family takes care of family," he'd said. Sophia had wanted to refuse. She'd known what Marco was. Elena had told her stories, carefully edited versions that didn't include their father's murder. But the weight of debt is crushing, and Marco's money came with no strings attached. He never asked for favors, never demanded anything in return. He just paid her tuition every semester for 3 years. Sophia told herself it was fine, that accepting money didn't make her complicit, that she could take his help and still be a good person. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she wondered what kind of doctor takes blood money. Elena had been furious when she found out. "He's buying your loyalty," Elena had said, her voice sharp. "He's making sure you owe him." "I don't owe him anything," Sophia had insisted. "It's just money." Nothing with Marco is just anything. But Sophia hadn't understood, not then. Not until Elena finally told her the truth about their father, about the warehouse in Red Hook, about the screams that no one heard, about the way Marco had ordered Vincent Russo's death over a $2,000 discrepancy that turned out to be a bank error. Sophia had cried for 3 days. Then she'd asked the only question that mattered: "What do you need me to do?" Elena had held her sister's hand. "I need you to become the best medical student Marco Valentini has ever sponsored. I need you to make him proud. I need him to trust you completely." "Why?" "Because when the time comes," Elena had said quietly, "you're the one he never sees coming." Sophia had spent the next year studying not just medicine, but poisons, neurotoxins, paralytics, the exact dosages needed to simulate death without causing it. She'd practiced on cadavers in the university lab, perfecting the technique. She'd become a weapon, and Marco had paid for every lesson. Trust is a currency in the underworld, but what exactly is the exchange rate for betrayal? FBI Special Agent Marcus Chen had been tracking the Valentini organization for 7 years. He'd built cases that collapsed at the last minute, witnesses who disappeared, evidence that vanished, judges who suddenly retired. The Valentini family had roots that went deep into New York's infrastructure. Cops, lawyers, politicians. Trying to take them down was like fighting smoke. But 3 months ago, something had changed. Chen had received an anonymous package at his office in Federal Plaza. Inside was a USB drive containing financial records that detailed every illegal transaction the Valentini organization had conducted in the past 18 months. Shell companies, offshore accounts, bribes paid to city officials, names, dates, amounts. It was enough to destroy Marco Valentini completely. The information was too clean, too organized. Someone inside the organization was feeding them intelligence. Chen had seen this before, internal power struggles that led to betrayal. But this felt different. This felt personal. He'd tried to trace the source, failed. Whoever was providing information knew how to cover their tracks. But the data kept coming. Every 2 weeks, another package, another piece of Marco's empire exposed. Chen's superiors were ecstatic. They'd authorized wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations. The case against Marco Valentini was becoming airtight. Indictments were being prepared, arrest warrants drafted. But Chen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The information was too good, too perfectly timed. It felt less like an investigation and more like someone was orchestrating something larger, someone who wanted Marco destroyed but couldn't or wouldn't do it themselves. Chen had started digging into Marco's inner circle. Most of the soldiers were predictable, violent men with limited intelligence, but one name kept appearing in the financial records with unusual frequency: Elena Russo. She'd been with the organization for 5 years, no criminal record, no family connections to organized crime. She just appeared one day and worked her way up through sheer competence. Chen had pulled her background. Her father had died in a warehouse fire in Red Hook 15 years ago. Accidental, according to the report. But Chen had been a federal agent long enough to know that nothing connected to the Valentini family was ever accidental. He'd started surveillance on Elena, watched her movements, tracked her communications, and that's when he'd noticed the sister, Sophia Russo, medical student at Columbia, tuition paid by Marco Valentini personally. 2 sisters, one inside the organization, one being groomed from the outside. Chen had seen this pattern before. It never ended well. He'd tried to make contact with Elena, left messages, sent warnings through encrypted channels, but she'd ignored every attempt. She didn't want federal help. She wanted something else. And that terrified him more than any crime boss ever could. Justice and revenge look similar from a distance, but up close, one builds societies, the other burns them down. Marco Valentini discovered the betrayal on a random Tuesday. He'd been reviewing financial discrepancies with his accountant when he'd noticed something odd. Small amounts of money, never enough to trigger concern, had been systematically redirected into accounts that didn't exist. The trail was almost invisible. Almost. Marco had built his empire on attention to detail. He'd survived 3 decades in a business where carelessness meant death. So when he saw the pattern, he'd known immediately. Someone was stealing from him, not for profit, for evidence. He'd called in his tech specialist, a former NSA contractor who'd been forced to resign after selling government secrets. Within 48 hours, they'd traced the leak. Elena Russo. Marco had sat in his office for an hour after receiving the news, staring at Elena's employee file. He'd trusted her, promoted her, treated her like the daughter he'd never had, and she'd been dismantling his organization piece by piece. His underboss had wanted to kill her immediately, make it messy, make it public, send a message to anyone else who thought about betrayal. But Marco was smarter than that. No, he'd said quietly, we don't kill her yet. First, we find out who she's working for. They'd put Elena under surveillance, monitored her communications, followed her every movement. But Elena was careful. She never met with federal agents, never made suspicious phone calls, never did anything that would confirm she was the source. So Marco had done something clever. He'd started feeding Elena false information, fake transactions, manufactured evidence of crimes that didn't exist. And then he'd waited to see if that information surfaced in federal investigations. It had. Within a week, FBI agents had raided 3 warehouses that Marco had deliberately listed in the fake records. They'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. Marco had smiled when he'd received the news. Elena had proven her guilt. Now he could move forward. But he hadn't wanted a quick death for her. That would be too merciful. He'd wanted Elena to know that he'd discovered her betrayal, wanted her to understand that her entire mission had been futile, wanted her to die knowing she'd failed. So he'd planned the dinner, the poisoned dessert, the intimate confession. He'd called Elena into his office on a Friday afternoon. "I want you to come to my estate tomorrow night. Dinner, just the two of us. We need to discuss your future with the family." Elena had smiled. "Of course, I'd be honored." Markham had watched her leave, already imagining the look on her face when she realized what he'd done. He'd made his first mistake then. He assumed Elena's motivation was money, power, ambition, the usual reasons people betray. He'd never considered that her motivation might be something far more personal, something that had been planted 15 years ago in a warehouse in Red Hook, something that had grown in the dark, patient and cold, waiting for exactly this moment. Marco Valentini had spent 3 decades being the smartest person in every room, and that arrogance had finally blinded him. What happens when the hunter realizes he's been the prey all along? The estate in Westchester County sat on 12 acres of manicured perfection. Elena arrived at 7 p.m., dressed in black, carrying a bottle of wine she'd never drink. The security guards at the gate recognized her, waved her through without searching her car. She'd been here dozens of times. She was family. Marco greeted her at the door personally. "Elena, you look beautiful." "Thank you." Her voice was calm, perfect. They'd eaten in the formal dining room, pasta carbonara, roasted vegetables, bread baked fresh that afternoon. Marco had been charming. He'd told stories about the old days, about his father and grandfather, about the wars that had shaped New York's underworld. Elena had laughed at the right moments, asked the right questions, played her role flawlessly. And then came dessert. "I had them make your favorite," Marco had said, placing the ricotta cheesecake in front of her. "I remember you mentioning it months ago." Elena had smiled. "You have a good memory." "I remember everything about the people I care about." She'd taken the first bite. The poison had no taste. The chef who'd prepared it, one of Marco's most loyal soldiers, had made sure of that. Elena had eaten 3 more bites before setting down her fork. "Marco, there's something I need to tell you." "Oh?" He'd leaned back, wine glass in hand, perfectly relaxed. "I've been having doubts about the family, about this life." "Doubts are natural, Elena, especially for someone as intelligent as you." "I just wonder sometimes if we're doing the right thing." Marco had studied her face. "And what do you think is the right thing?" "I don't know anymore." She'd pressed a hand to her stomach. "I feel strange." "Strange how?" "Dizzy. My chest feels tight." Marco had checked his watch. The poison worked fast. She had maybe 10 minutes before the real symptoms began. "Perhaps you should lie down." "Yes, maybe I should." Elena had stood, swayed slightly, then collapsed. Marco had caught her, lowered her to the floor gently. He'd called for his doctor, the same man who'd helped administer poison to 3 other traitors over the years. But Elena had made one request before she'd accepted Marco's dinner invitation. She'd asked if Sophia could be present. Her sister was studying emergency medicine, Elena had said. It would be a good experience for her to observe a private physician at work. Marco had agreed. Why wouldn't he? Sophia was harmless, just a medical student he'd generously supported. So when they'd brought Elena to the private medical facility in Marco's basement, a fully equipped emergency room that existed for exactly these situations, Sophia had been waiting there, dressed in scrubs, professional, invisible. The paralytic agent Sophia had given Elena 3 hours before the dinner had been carefully calculated. It would slow her heart rate, suppress her breathing, create every symptom of severe neurotoxin poisoning. But Elena would remain fully conscious, able to hear everything. Sophia had administered it through her illicit insulin pen. Elena wasn't diabetic, but she'd been carrying the pen for months, training everyone around her to ignore it. Just another medical device, nothing suspicious. Now, watching Marco lean over her sister's supposedly dying body, Sophia prepared the real poison, the same poison Marco had used, but triple the dose. And she waited for him to make his confession. Sometimes the performance isn't for the audience. Sometimes it's for the confession. Marco Valentini had always believed in the power of truth. Not public truth, not the truth that appeared in newspapers or courtrooms, but personal truth, the kind you delivered to someone in their final moments, the kind that destroyed them from the inside. He'd stood over Elena's body, watching the oxygen mask fog with each labored breath, and he'd decided to give her that gift. "I've known for 3 weeks," he'd said quietly, "about the FBI, about the information you've been feeding them, about everything." Elena's eyes had moved behind closed lids. She could hear him. "I have to admit, you were clever, more clever than most. The way you buried the evidence trails, the way you never made direct contact. Professional." He'd smiled. "But I've been doing this for 30 years, Elena. You think you're the first person who tried to betray me?" The heart monitor had beeped steadily. Sophia, standing near the equipment, had kept her face neutral, professional, just a medical student observing a case. Marco had continued, his voice almost gentle. "I want you to know that I fed you false information. For 2 weeks, everything you sent to the FBI was manufactured. They raided empty warehouses, investigated phantom accounts. You helped them waste resources on nothing." He'd leaned closer. "Your entire mission was pointless. Every risk you took, every piece of evidence you gathered, I was 3 steps ahead the whole time." Then he'd said the words that Elena had been waiting 15 years to hear. "You're just like your father, you know, Vincent. He was clever too. Thought he could skim money from my accounts without me noticing. A bookkeeper who got too ambitious." Marco had shaken his head. "I gave him a chance to confess, to apologize, but he lied to my face, said it was a bank error." Elena's hand had twitched. Sophia had noticed, but said nothing. "So I had him burned alive, warehouse in Red Hook, made it look accidental." Marco's voice had held no remorse. "Your mother never knew the truth, neither did you, not until you started digging, I assume. That's why you came here, isn't it? This was never about justice. This was about revenge." He'd laughed then, a cold sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "And you failed, just like he did. The Russo family line ends in failure. That's your legacy, Elena. You and your father. Both of you died trying to take something from me, and both of you died with nothing." The heart monitor's beeping had slowed. Marco had checked his watch. "It's almost over now. The poison is shutting down your organs. Another few minutes and—" That's when he'd felt the needle. Cold, sharp, precise. He'd turned, confused, and seen Sophia standing behind him, no longer invisible, no longer harmless. "What?" "The same poison you used, only I gave you enough to kill 5 men. You have about 3 minutes, maybe less." Marco had reached for his neck, stumbled backward. His legs had stopped working. The physician who'd been standing in the corner had backed away, terrified, realizing too late that he'd walked into something he didn't understand. Elena's eyes had opened behind the oxygen mask, clear, focused, alive. She'd removed the mask slowly, sat up and looked at Marco as he collapsed to his knees. "You killed my father over a bank error," Elena had said quietly. "An error, not theft, not betrayal, just a mistake that the bank corrected 2 days later. But you didn't care about the truth. You cared about sending a message." Marco had tried to speak, but his throat had closed. "So I spent 15 years becoming someone you'd trust, someone you'd keep close, and I waited for you to feel safe enough to tell me the truth." Elena had stood, walked over to where he was dying on the floor. "Thank you for that, Marco. I needed to hear you admit what you'd done." His vision had started to blur. "The FBI has everything now, real evidence, not the fake information you fed me. I kept 2 sets of records, one for you to track and one you never knew existed. By tomorrow morning, every judge you've bribed, every cop you've bought, every politician in your pocket, they'll all be under federal investigation." Elena had knelt beside him. "Your empire is gone, your legacy is destroyed, and you're going to die knowing that the daughter of the man you murdered is the one who took everything from you." Marco's last thought was the clearest one he'd had in years. He'd underestimated them, both of them, and that mistake had cost him everything. Pride is the drug that kills most powerfully, not with pain, but with clarity. The federal raids began at dawn. FBI agents hit 15 locations simultaneously across New York: warehouses in Brooklyn, offices in Manhattan, private homes in Westchester. They arrested 63 people connected to the Valentini organization: cops, lawyers, accountants, city officials. The arrests wouldn't stop for weeks. Agent Marcus Chen had coordinated the operation from Federal Plaza, watching the live feeds as his teams executed search warrants. He'd spent 7 years building cases that collapsed. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. By 8 a.m., the news networks were covering the story, the largest organized crime takedown in New York history. Marco Valentini? Found dead in his estate. Apparent suicide, the initial report said, but Chen knew better. He'd gone to the estate himself, walked through the medical facility in the basement where Marco's body had been found. The coroner's preliminary report indicated neurotoxin poisoning, the same type found in Elena Russo's system. But Elena had survived. She'd been found unconscious in the same room, rushed to a hospital in Brooklyn, treated for poison exposure, and released 6 hours later, weak but alive. Her sister Sophia had been the one to call 911. She'd been at the estate for a dinner party, she'd told police. She'd heard Marco's doctor shouting, rushed to the medical facility, and found both Marco and Elena collapsed. She'd tried to save them both. The story was clean, almost too clean. But without evidence of foul play and with Marco's organization collapsing around them, NYPD had filed it as a murder-suicide gone wrong. Marco had poisoned Elena. Elena's body had reacted unpredictably. Marco, realizing he'd exposed himself, had taken his own poison. Case closed. Chen knew it was a lie. He'd watched Elena Russo for months. He'd seen her pattern of behavior. This woman didn't get sloppy, didn't make mistakes. She'd orchestrated something brilliant, and he couldn't prove any of it. He'd visited her in the hospital, found her sitting up in bed, looking pale but composed. "You won," Chen had said quietly. "What won?" Elena's voice had been steady. "Whatever this was, your revenge, your plan. You destroyed him." "I didn't destroy anyone. I survived, that's all." Chen had studied her face. "He killed your father, didn't he? Vincent Russo? The warehouse fire 15 years ago." Elena had met his eyes. "My father died in an accident. That's what the report says." "Reports can be wrong." "Yes, they can." She smiled slightly. "But they're the official record, and official records are what matter in court, aren't they, Agent Chen?" He had no response to that. "The evidence I provided, was it useful?" Elena had asked. "Very." "Good. Then justice was served. Marco Valentini's organization is gone. Dozens of corrupt officials are under investigation. The city is safer." She'd paused. "That's what you wanted, isn't it, Agent Chen?" Chen had nodded slowly. "And what did you want?" "The same thing." Elena's smile had faded. "Exactly the same thing." She'd been lying. Chen knew it. But he also knew that sometimes the law failed people. Sometimes the only justice available was the kind you built yourself, carefully, over years. He'd left the hospital without another word. 2 weeks later, Elena and Sophia had left New York. No forwarding address, no trace. They'd vanished into the country as completely as they'd appeared in Marco's world. The Mafia families that remained, the ones not caught in the federal net, told a different story. They said the Russo sisters executed the perfect revenge, that they played Marco Valentini like a violin, that his arrogance killed him more surely than any poison. Some said it was justice, others called it murder, but everyone agreed on one thing: never underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose. In Brooklyn, in a small apartment that had once belonged to Vincent Russo, a memorial stood untouched. Photos of a man who died in a warehouse fire, photos of his wife who died of grief, and now 2 new photos, Marco Valentini's obituary and a chess piece, a queen. In the criminal underworld, the Russo sisters became legend, a cautionary tale about revenge, about patience, about the cost of underestimating those you deemed beneath you. But Elena Russo never told the story herself. She'd gotten what she came for, and sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones you never have to explain. Because checkmate doesn't require applause, it just requires the king to fall. Some stories don't have happy endings, they have necessary ones. Elena and Sofia Russo didn't walk away clean, they walked away changed, carrying the weight of what they'd done, knowing that they'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But their father's name was cleared. The investigation into his death was reopened after Marco's files were seized. Vincent Russo's accounting error was proven to be exactly what he claimed it was, a bank mistake. His reputation was restored posthumously. It didn't bring him back, but it gave his daughters something they'd lost 15 years ago: peace. The truth about revenge is that it doesn't erase pain, it doesn't undo trauma, it doesn't resurrect the dead or restore lost time. Revenge is simply the act of balancing scales that should never have been tipped. And sometimes, in a world where power protects monsters and justice moves too slowly to save the innocent, revenge is the only language that evil understands. Did Elena and Sofia do the right thing? That's not for me to decide. That's the question you'll carry with you long after this story ends. Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones that give you answers, they're the ones that force you to find your own. If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, understanding, or just the guilty satisfaction of watching a monster fall, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. This is the kind of content we create here. Stories that challenge you, stories that refuse to let you look away. If you want more stories that hit this hard, that make you think and feel in equal measure, then do me a favor. Leave a comment telling me what you thought, share this with someone who appreciates complex, morally ambiguous narratives, and hit that subscribe button because the next story is already waiting. And trust me, you won't see it coming either.